It's always an honor to be at ECC and be part of the important work that people who teach here and work here are doing in the community, basically embodying and trying to bring forth the kind of change that we talk about in our classrooms. I'd like to apologize for not being able to make it to the conference earlier. I just came into town last night, had a speaking gig at Wells College, and pretty much wasn't free to attend some of the sessions, so I'd like to apologize. And I have a prepared talk which I'll work with, and then I want to open up the floor. I hopefully am leaving a good amount of time at the end to open up the floor for questions and discussion. In 1988, I'm going to move around a little bit. Are we good? Okay. In 1988, I lived in Guatemala, and when I lived there, we had small earthquakes. They're a little bit unnerving for somebody from New York, but eventually I got used to them. Where I lived, they were mostly curiosities. But in poor neighborhoods nearby, in neighborhoods where my friends lived, houses would collapse. Similar mid-sized earthquakes in the region seemed to almost surgically strike at the poor, whose poorly constructed houses would often crumble. While wealthy people lived in houses that were built to withstand such tremors. The collapse of these homes, I want to make this clear, the collapse of the homes of poor people was not a natural disaster in a region where wealthy people's homes did not collapse. Similarly, floods in the region seemed to make surgical strikes as well, washing away poor communities. While wealthier communities were built on higher ground, they'd be spared. We later saw the same basic phenomenon in New Orleans. Historically, wealthy people live on high ground, poor people live in floodplains. So when you see houses washed away, again, it's almost always the houses of poor people. This is not a natural disaster. These are social disasters. Same applies to famine, disease, pandemics, and so on. People here are probably not even aware, but the corn yield is expected to be low in the United States. This is not going to affect our consumption of corn. This is going to lead to starvation in other countries, and it's going to lead to difficult times for poor people in the United States. But for middle-class people in the United States, it just means the budget is going to be a little bit tighter, right? We're going to still take corn and make fuel for cars, because this is not going to be famine, right? Famine also is a social disaster. All of these things are glossed with this word disaster. But the poor are usually the unnatural victims of what we call natural disasters. The victimhood is not natural, it's engineered into our social systems. That's what this conference is about, that's what the work that sociologists and historians is all about. This disparity is seldom discussed when the media contextualizes what they call disaster. This is also why it's so important to teach history. And up until the college level, students don't really get history. When I teach a 101 class and start talking about Columbus, who basically, the man we celebrate was the father of the transatlantic slave trade. Students are just dumbfounded. Why didn't anybody tell me this before? The most boring subject in high school now is history. And we know this should be the most vibrant. It should be a forensic investigation. They all want to be, one of the main things that students going into college now want to be is forensic pathologists, because of all of the crime, all of the crime shows, right? So, but history is a forensic examination where you search and navigate between these lies looking for the truth. But it's the most boring subject in high school, because once you take the truth out of history, there's nothing left but bullshit, right? And students, if this generation of students can do anything, they can spot bullshit, because they're inundated with it from the time they first turn on the TV. When most of the news is propaganda and lies, you become very media literate, but also you become very very jaded. In that it seems like there's no truth out there. So history becomes boring because they're just made up stories to students. Okay. So we don't contextualize disaster, we never talk about social systems. It's just easier to blame God for all of these disasters, right? Act of God, right? Rather than blame social inequality. If you're a religious person, I think that you'd be especially upset by this kind of, blaming everything on God or kind of thing, right? Ultimately, part of class privilege, and everybody in this room enjoys some modicum of class privilege and suffers from some degree of class oppression. But once you actually set foot in college and register for classes and succeed and complete a semester, you have changed your social class a little bit. So you're now moving into an area where you're going to be privy to some level of class privilege. Students at ECC, like my students at Buff State, also are oppressed in that, you're usually working 20 or 30 hours a week, 40 hours a week. So going to college is a lot more difficult for people who are poorer than it is for people who are sent to college and have the privilege of being full-time college students. Okay, so ultimately, class privilege. We see how it plays out in the classroom. It ultimately means you don't starve when there's famine, you don't drown when there are floods, your house is less likely to collapse when there is an earthquake. Perhaps those who enjoy the bounty of social inequality ultimately believe that their privilege, their safety from disaster, is also an act of God. This assumed privilege, that is an act of God, this is what we call racism, right? So class privilege is also justified by some kind of racism, oftentimes. In media studies, we have an exchange rate between the value of first world lives versus the value of third world lives. Going back to my time in Guatemala, when I lived in Guatemala, a ferry boat capsized, and I think something along the lines of 200 people drowned. At the same day, a bus full of European skiers, I think somewhere in the Alps, went off the road and 16 people died. The bus accident was front page of the New York Times. I think the ferry boat actually had 70 deaths. The ferry boat accident was buried in the barrels of the New York Times because it's just poor Guatemalans dying. And poor Guatemalans always die. Ultimately, we're supposed to relate more to European tourists on a ski holiday. And we even see this, what happens when a college student in this town is killed. This is more than just race, it's class. A Buff State student, about 10 years ago, was shot to death in Allentown. And that was a lead story for about 2 weeks. Whereas people are killed all the time on the east side of Buffalo. But that's where people are supposed to be killed. So your life becomes worth less, right? So we contextualize disaster in the same way. There are people who are supposed to suffer, people who are supposed to die, people who aren't. The language we use to contextualize disaster certainly doesn't challenge this divine racist order. You know where I'm going with this, okay? Economic crisis is a disaster. It's one of those vapid descriptors. It has no real meaning. It's not telling us anything. Economic crisis, what does this mean? It's an empty term. But unlike terms like natural disaster, that simply hide a class-based immunity in the face of mass suffering, the term economic crisis is more insidious. It doesn't simply hide the imbalance of suffering brought on by the financial events that commenced in 2008. And we know they didn't really commence in 2008, but that's the way we contextualize it, right? It doesn't simply hide the imbalance of suffering. It ignores the fact that this crisis, there aren't just varying degrees of loss among the losers. There are actually winners. So two things here, right? If a billionaire loses half their wealth, their lifestyle is going to change a hell of a lot less than a poor person who's living on the edge who loses 20% of their wealth, 20% of their salary. Because that's enough to push them over the edge. That's enough to decide, what meal you're going to skip, what essential payment you're going to skip, whether or not you can buy textbooks, okay? So the loss, we suffer that in varying degrees, but there are winners. We're all familiar with the massive bailouts on Wall Street, massive bailouts to corporate America, and we're now seeing that it's poor and working class Americans who are supposed to foot the bill for this historically unprecedented corporate welfare. Real wages are still plummeting while worker productivity continues to rise. We are creating more wealth and we are seeing less of that wealth that we create. Services that we've taken for granted for over a century, right? things like public education. I was talking to a student who was shocked to find out that there used to be no tuition in the City University of New York up until 1975. That SUNY was essentially free up until 1960s, right? Things that we took for granted for over a century, things like public education. I mean, the very notion of a chair in a public classroom waiting for you is now in peril, right? Even healthcare, policing, firefighting. There was a house that was allowed to burn to the ground. I think was that Iowa, right? Because somebody didn't pay their private, firefighting fee. Garbage collection and the socialism of highway maintenance, right? These are all in peril. I wrote an article about the socialism of snow plowing. I mean, there's that fallacy. One of the things one of the big problems I see is that students actually graduate from high school thinking this is a capitalist society. And they walk into my classroom touting the benefits of capitalism, how capitalism gave us all of this. I'm like, wait a second, capitalism gave us none of this, right? Where are we? Who built this building, right? Who owns this building? The reason why there was a classroom here for you is because we use the threat of violence to take money away from the rich and build a school for you, right? That's not capitalism, right? So what's going on here? Again, we don't really contextualize these things. Okay. As governments now defund these institutions that maintain our already woefully inadequate social safety net, we as a society are facing a growing social disaster. This is the real disaster. It's a social disaster, masked as an economic disaster. On the other side of the equation, however, the financial institutions whose reckless and possibly criminal behavior caused the current crisis, they are not simply immune from its effects, they are now profiting from our intensifying social disaster. So we're seeing record corporate profits, record corporate bonuses, that this year surpassed last year, which was a previous record, right? The financial sector, the people who assembled and marketed the junk bonds, invented the derivatives that bankrupted their own institutions, they are now once again enjoying unprecedented record profits. We socialized the costs. We socialize the risks like we do with nuclear power, and we privatize the profits. So when they turned upside down, we fitted the bill to put them right side up again, and they are now paying themselves, once again, these record-breaking bonuses. Here's a very short timeline to contextualize this disaster. In 2008, we bailed out the banks in corporate America. In 2009, they earned record-breaking profits. In 2010, they broke their 2009 record for profits. In 2011, as the same financial executives that engineered the collapse of 2008 reap record multi-million-dollar bonuses, the rest of us are expected to endure crisis-level sacrifices. And make no mistake about it, crisis-level sacrifices. This is a crisis that we are now facing, when we have to choose between, are we going to collect garbage? Are we going to provide emergency triage? We're enduring crisis-level sacrifices, essentially to pay off this massive wealth transfer that finances the pillage of the financial sector. Austerity. That's another word that's popping up, right? Austerity is this crisis's media mantra. So if you watch the corporate press, we're told that austerity, right? We have to trim our belts. Essential services under this mantra of austerity are cut, benefits fall, public sector workers are laid off. By the way, we're talking about public sector workers. We started laying off full-time faculty 30 years ago in the SUNY system. We're at a point right now where we are so upside down, we have so few full-time faculty, that we really can't lay anybody else off without just telling students, you're not going to graduate in 4 years, we have no spaces for you in classrooms, we can't advise you, and so on. So it's not like we really have people who are sitting around not doing anything who can be laid off. We're taking a sector of the population that have committed their lives to public service and have been working harder and harder and harder for over a generation, and we're cutting them and cutting those jobs. We can't forget about them, forget about their families, forget about their jobs. We cannot live without the services that they provide. But at the very same time that we're seeing essential services cut, people die on roads this winter because they're not salted, because municipalities have run out of budgets. I mean, this is like, again, the socialism of snow plowing is what people are fighting against, right? But at the same time, sales and luxury goods are once again soaring. Yachts, $250,000 Bugattis. Suddenly, there's a revival, at least in one sector of the economy. And the wealth inequality that was already at a toxic, robber baron era level before this crisis has grown even larger. My point is that for the American plutocracy, what we're experiencing is not a crisis. It's an opportunity-rich environment. They are benefiting from our disaster. Terms like economic crisis obfuscate was actually a vicious and aggressive class war. So just think about substituting the term class war every time you hear CNN say economic crisis, because that's what's happening. It's a class war. Class war is not about working class people rising up. Right? Class war is about people with a pathological level of greed crushing and destroying the very society that they depend on for their livelihoods and their privilege. It is sickness. Well, it's the parasite that just grew too large. Okay? Which, by the way, I just read an article in, it wasn't Financial Times, something, Market Watch, about as far right-wing as anything I can bear reading. And it was an article about how we've got to stop this greed that the richest 1%, who own 95% of the wealth of the country, are exercising, because workers and the poor and the middle class are going to rise up, and society will become destroyed. This is Market Watch. I'm not reading Workers' World here. Right? This is Market Watch. Terms like economic crisis, obfuscate this class war. It's our responsibility, those of us in this room, as educators, as sociologists, as historians, as journalists, to speak clearly and concisely and with precision. This is one of the biggest problems with journalists. They think there's some kind of a story that they're supposed to tell. What is that story? It's a story everybody else is telling. If you don't march lockstep with everybody else, then somehow you're putting yourself out there. Well, why are you putting yourself out there? You're putting yourself out there because nobody is practicing journalism anymore in this country. This is why Americans are looking to Al Jazeera for news. Why Americans are buying, I just bought an internet radio so I can just hit a button in my kitchen and listen to the BBC, because I'm not getting news from NPR, right? So, nobody's practicing, and I'm telling, well, there is, just an aside, a few years ago, I spoke to a group of Ukrainian journalists, and all of these folks had studied to be journalists under an oppressive, an oppressive, essentially totalitarian government. There was no free press. But they studied anyway. And eventually, lo and behold, for a minute there was a free press, right? And that's what I'm telling students today, because most students who begin as journalism majors, once they realize what they're getting into, once we start teaching them how to get arrested, for instance, you have the freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want, but freedom of speech does not actually, apply to collecting the news. Photojournalists especially get a little bit too close to the news, right? They're documenting a little bit too much. So we now have to teach them how to get arrested, and then once they start realizing the salaries for journalists now, if they can find a job, then they all start transferring into public relations, right? Which uses the same skill set, and pays many times more in service to capital as opposed to in service to the people, right? And I tell the students who stick with journalism that, there will be jobs again for journalism. You just have to have faith. You have to make that job. Maybe you have to go and become Al Jazeera's Buffalo correspondent, but there will be jobs for journalists. When we parrot the corporate media script, we abdicate this responsibility to speak clearly. Economic crisis seems like an innocuous descriptor, but its power stems from its benign veneer. It catches us off guard. It fails to identify causes and effects. It just identifies crisis. It doesn't identify whose crisis this is. class war, right? Let's think back to global conquest. Traditionally, when colonizers invaded new lands, they renamed them. The act of renaming was a symbolic act of taking possession. The same holds true of political moments. The handful of corporations and corporate-funded public media outlets that monopolize the popular media interpretations of events in this country through the newspapers, magazines, broadcasts, cable casts, they exercise the power to appropriate interpretations through the control of language. Ultimately, they have the power to decontextualize class war by using vapid terminology that says nothing. Economic crisis. The richest 1% of the population, the American oligarchy, own more of the country's wealth now than the poorest 95% of the population, which we will call the people, okay? So let's use terms like oligarchy. Let's use terms like people when we write, when we teach. It's just for the sake of clarity. We're not following a political ideology or agenda. We're just trying to use the language effectively as communicators. During the past 2 decades, this American oligarchy has doubled its share of the national income. Much of this increase has come on the backs of uncompensated increases in worker productivity. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was a Republican for those who were not around in 1958 and 1959, right? When Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, the oligarchy paid 91% of their income in taxes. Republican presidency, Eisenhower, the oligarchy paid 91%. You know what, right? The Kennedy administration cut that rate to 77%. LBJ, Great Society, anti-poverty programs, cut that rate to 70%. Republicans, Nixon and Ford, when they came to office, they held the line, taxing the oligarchs at 70%, because Republicans used to be fiscal conservatives, which meant, you balance budgets, right? So Democrats cut the rates, Republicans had them at 91%, Democrats cut the rates down to 70%, Republicans held the line at 70% because it made sense. It kept the fiscal house from burning down, kept us from having a mysterious crisis. Jimmy Carter held firm at the 70% tax rate throughout his presidency as well. But he cut the taxes on the poorest Americans from 14% to nothing. That's a kind of tax cut that, we can deal with. All of that money goes, what do poor people do when you put money in their hands? You think they hold on to it for like a second, right? You want to stimulate the economy, you don't give money to rich people for them to invest in China. You give money to poor people who will spend it immediately, within a minute. Reagan financed his tax cuts for the rich through deficit spending and cuts to programs that benefited the majority of working Americans, such as higher education. So this is where we started seeing, decimating cuts in budgets for higher education, high reliance on contingent adjunct faculty member, exploited faculty members, people who have to, what we call Rhodes Scholars, RAD, because you have to teach in 3 different campuses, 7 different courses, 9 different courses to put together a living. That has a very bad benefit on your relationship with students, ability to teach, and so on, right? This all started with Reagan. As deficits grew, his administration cut more programs that served poor and middle-class Americans, using the quote-unquote savings to service a national debt and offset more tax cuts, again, for the richest Americans. In 1987, and this is where this current crisis comes from, this class war, it comes from Reagan, right? As unkind as my words will be about Ronald Reagan and what he did to our economy and what he did to the disparity of wealth in this country, I know people in Central America who have far more unkind things to say about Ronald Reagan, having lived or died in his Central American wars at the time. But we'll focus on the economy. In 87, Reagan cut taxes for the oligarchy by 11.5%, down to 38.5%, while raising taxes on the working poor, with people earning $2,750, seeing their tax rate increase 36%. So under Reagan, he cut the tax rate, again, for the wealthiest Americans, for the plutocracy, for the aristocracy, right? while raising tax rates on the poorest Americans by 36% to help offset the tax decrease for the wealthy. Desperately poor workers, those earning a taxable income of between 1 penny and $1,500 a year, they saw their tax rate jump from 0%, as in nothing, Jimmy Carter's tax cut, to 11% under Ronald Reagan. I can only term this last part of the Reagan tax bill of 1986 as mean-spirited and economically sadistic, netting an insignificant revenue for the government while exacerbating the economic stress on an already suffering population. So, trickle-down Reagan economics? Sadism, economically sadistic. This is class war, plain and simple, class war and unabashed greed. This was a case of those who could afford to live in luxury taking from those who couldn't afford to live, period. I can't see any other way to describe this. We as educators, we as journalists, we have to be precise when we describe this period of American history. A year later, Reagan again cut taxes for the oligarchy by another 10.5%, while again raising taxes on the poorest workers from 11 to 15%. We don't usually teach that in high school history classes. Reagan was just grandfatherly, right? You know, he had a pleasant demeanor. We don't talk about what he did. This is where taxes stayed until the elder George Herbert Walker Bush, actually raised them to 31% in 1991. Bill Clinton brought taxes back near 1987 levels, combating the federal deficit. We oftentimes talk about how Clinton was able to cut the deficit, but we don't talk about how he did it by raising taxes. He raised the maximum tax rate in the oligarchy back up to 39.6%, still way below where it was when Eisenhower was president, 91%. It was still, and Bill Clinton's tax rate of 39.6% on the oligarchy was still 30% less than it was when Reagan first took office. Then came George W. Bush, who cut the top rate to 35% while, incidentally, starting an unfunded $1 trillion war. This is the tax cut that the U.S. Congress and President Obama just extended. The oligarchy pays maximum 35% in taxes. When oligarchs in developed countries get tax cuts, their take-home income soars, leaving them with a surplus of money, which history has shown they will then wildly and irresponsibly invest in speculative assets because they have more money than they can spend. So they invest it. And they create various market bubbles by wildly investing the surplus they just got through these windfall tax breaks. When markets correct and these bubbles spectacularly burst, they create radical disruptions that crash economies. In the roaring 1920s, when the tax rates for the richest Americans decreased from 73% to 25%, the rich invested wildly, driving up stock prices to unsustainable levels, just like the housing bubble we've seen. When the market corrected, it gave us the great crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. The next major crash came a few years after Ronald Reagan slashed taxes on members of the oligarchy, creating another bubble bust cycle. The years between these crashes, however, when taxes in the oligarchy were in the 70 to 91% range, we saw a historically unprecedented period of economic stability. When Bush Jr. cut taxes further, we got another bubble, followed by another big crash or crisis. Tax cuts and other forms of wealth redistribution, favoring the oligarchy, historically has set the conditions for economic collapse, which, in the current model, further exacerbates social inequality. Overall, when taxes are higher, income for working class and middle class taxpayers also historically risen, even adjusted for inflation, since the labor market is modulated by real after-tax income. Inversely, when taxes are cut, real income for these same people has tended to drop. So tax cuts tend to be followed by real income drops for working people. Tax increases tend to be followed by real income increases. And possibly because one of the things we do when we actually have taxes to collect is we actually spend it on infrastructure, which creates jobs. The opposite, okay, taxes are cut, Real income for working people tends to drop. The opposite, however, has historically held true for the oligarchy, whose income drops drastically when taxes rise, and rises at a similar rate when taxes are cut. Hence, the oligarchy has a vested interest in keeping taxes low, while the rest of us have a vested interest in seeing taxes high. The oligarchy, however, can back up their interests with money, which they often invest in buying media organizations, which parrot their anti-tax mantras. This is why the founding fathers warned against allowing a super wealthy class to emerge. And until the late 19th century, even after adjusting income into today's dollars, there were no billionaires. Even after adjusting for inflation in today's dollars, there were no billionaires. This is a relatively recent concept, a 20th century concept. The fear was that such a class would have the financial resources to dominate a political system as we see them doing right now, rendering democracy obsolete, which we've seen last year with the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court. Political scientists point out that you cannot have both a massive economic inequality and democracy. These things do not co-inhabit the same space. You cannot have it. It's a fantasy. You either have democracy or you have social inequality and a plutocracy. You cannot have a plutocracy and a democracy. But let's go back to the Reagan presidency for a moment. And I guess it's important. You know, when you talk about these things, you have to always go back to Reagan. This is where the crisis happened. This is where it began. We are now feeling the effects. We've been feeling the effects for a generation. We're now feeling the effects even harder. This is where the seeds of the current crisis were sown. Polling data at the time when Reagan was president showed that the grandfatherly Reagan was personally very popular. You know, you'd want to have Christmas dinner with him. But his slash and burn social policies, by contrast, never were popular. Rather than engage in a losing argument about social programs, Reagan instead saddled the nation with a bankruptcy-bound tax structure. Cutting taxes basically created an economic machine whereby the nation was bound to go bankrupt, and then would be forced, under the guise of crisis, to cut services. Cuts are not politically acceptable under any conditions otherwise. So, in essence, what Reagan did was he bypassed the whole argument about the social sector, and he forced the cuts to come at a future date under the banner of austerity and crisis. After Reagan is safely dead and buried, is when ultimately Reagan's chickens come home to roost. Let's call this a cagey class war, okay? You know, we don't even talk about it as a class war. We never discuss the issues. We just create the conditions by which this all happens on autopilot as a crisis. We shift the nation's economic priorities, redirecting its bounty from the people to the oligarchs, without any national debate. This is economic crisis. I personally never bought into the argument that Reagan was daft. Okay, you know, the common zeitgeist at the time. Reagan's an imbecile. Reagan was not an imbecile. Reagan was not daft. Reagan was a brilliant politician. Reagan got everything he dreamed of. He just was patient. Now let's mull over the tax history again that I cited. Think about the Eisenhower tax structure, whereby the oligarchy paid 91% of their income in taxes. Then think about the Nixon and Ford administrations, where they paid 70%. Even under those tax structures, rates that, if restored, could bail out our upside-down economy, fund a bloated military budget. I'm not even talking about cutting the military budget here, right? That's a whole different argument, right? If we restored the Eisenhower taxes at 91%, it could bail out our upside-down economy, deal with the deficit, fund this bloated military budget if that's what you want, and underwrite a modern New Deal for Main Street. And you know what? Even under those tax structures, it doesn't suck to be rich, right? Even with a 91% Eisenhower tax rate, it still doesn't suck to be rich. It really didn't. CEOs did not quit their jobs to enjoy lower tax rates as teachers, plumbers, or sanitation workers. It did not suck to be rich. Maybe their private jets were a little bit smaller than they would have liked, or perhaps they couldn't afford that 8th house, but life didn't suck, at least not for want of luxuries. So yes, there is a class war in America. Those of us who work for paychecks, however, did not start it. Nor have we even been defending ourselves or fighting back. We've just been ducking low in our foxholes and enjoying whatever crumbs came our way. That's because life hasn't really sucked for the American middle class either. You see, while we've been taking a hit in the American class war, we've been kicking ass in the global class war. My favorite sociologist recently explained this to me. We're all supposed to aspire to be middle class. That's the American dream. We're supposed to aspire to be middle class. This is the American dream that was dreamt for us before any of us were born, and drummed into our heads by corporate mass culture. We are supposed to aspire not to restore social equality at home, but to exploit social inequality in the global free market. Let me repeat that. We are not supposed to aspire to restore social equality at home, but instead to exploit social inequality in the global free market. The American dream is an endless supply of cheap booty manufactured by the hungriest, most exploited, most miserable people on the planet. While our share of the nation's wealth has been shrinking, our standard of living has been buoyed because we benefit from sweatshops, slave labor, and resource theft around the globe. The child laborer working 20-hour days assembling garments in one of Mumbai's Zari factories, the 1.5 million girls breathing toxic plastic fumes in the toy-making sweatshops of China's Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces, the electronic waste sorter knee-deep in silicon dust in Nanyang, Haitians toiling away in Mickey Mouse garments, toiling away making Mickey Mouse garments in Disney sweatshops in Port-au-Prince. And by the way, once I mentioned Disney, I don't know if you can put this up on your website, right? Disney really kind of polices any discussion whatsoever that is negative or in any way, sheds some light on this incredible social inequality that fuels the Disney empire. Hondurans picking bananas amid carcinogenic pesticides. And Adelandia, shield us. All of these people, the most exploited people in the world, they shield us from the full pain of our own class war. We can still go buy cheap bananas, we can still go buy cheap garments, we can still go buy cheap toys in the dollar store. I mean, think about the math on the dollar store. You can go in and buy a little clock. It's got some kind of electronic chip in it. It's got a printed circuit board that's put together. It's got a little kind of motor in there. Oftentimes even hand painted. And the whole thing comes together and is sold at the wholesale level and then shipped all the way around the planet on ships burning oil, unloaded at ports, loaded onto trains, taking hundreds of miles from ports inland to Buffalo, put into warehouses, loaded on trucks, and eventually sold to you in a store with a 25 or 35% markup, and you'll go in there and you buy it for $1. The mathematics, I mean, I'm not an economics whiz, but the mathematics don't make any sense to me, okay? Unless you just have incredible exploitation for the person or people who actually made that thing that you buy in the dollar store. And those are the people who are hiding the real social disparity and the inequality in our economy. They are the ones who are basically cushioning our fall with their lives. Our affordable Walmart Christmas is carried on their backs, and their poisoned air and their poisoned water. Ultimately, what we have in common with these workers for whom the economic crisis is a permanent condition, always has been, is that we are all robbed by the same global oligarchy. This is not an economic crisis. This is a war. People are dying. People are worked to death. People are starved to death. And sometimes people are shot or bombed to death. The more desperate the conditions, the cheaper they work, and the cheaper their resources are to pillage. This is all good for Wall Street's bottom line and for the folks who own most of what Wall Street peddles. For the same oligarchs who are enriching themselves to historically unprecedented levels as their media tells us to tighten our belts. This is global pillage. This is feudalism in the global village. Unless we address the current class war for what it is and we stop using vapid terminology to obfuscate the problem, we will not be ready or able to address it. This phenomena we call the global economic crisis resides at the intersection of where all the social science disciplines meet. This is the holistic thing. This is the synergy between all the disciplines represented in this room. It all adds up. We need everything, history, economics, sociology, psychology, anthropology, to really understand this monster we call the global economic crisis and understand it for the global class war that it is. The phenomenon, okay, this class war also, and very important, this class war has community college students in particular in its crosshairs. Teaching social sciences on the community college level has never, ever been more important. And for our students, it's never been more relevant. We have to talk with clarity, and we need to really explain what this thing we call a crisis is. Thank you. Yeah.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, as a student and a young person, what can I do to help? What can I do to fight back? What can we do to fight back? Because we're the next generation coming up, and I really feel we could do something. I just fail to realize what that is.
That's the toughest question. I'm really good at identifying the problem, right? That's the problem with academia. But students, over the years, students have raised, the similar issues. It's like, when, for instance, when we have right now a lot of unfilled faculty lines, which means that we can't register students into classes they want to take. And students complain about that. And my response to them is, why are you complaining to me? You are the ones who are allowing this to happen, right?
Do we
and
picket lines in front of Walmarts? Do we have like sit-ins in certain places?
Keep going. Write all these things down, right? We do all of these things because, we cannot be spectators in a democracy. And ultimately, there is a war against us. Things are moving against us. We either sit down and our own destruction, is a spectacle, right? And we get crushed, or we stand up. And again, I really, I don't want to, be one of those, faculty members that say, well, back in our day. But I remember when they were going to raise our tuitions by $100. We shut down the institution, and we made a hell of a lot of noise. And we made re-election an untenable prospect for a lot of politicians in this state. And over and over and over again, students in SUNY fought, got your parents to fight, right? Now, I actually believe that the statewide SUNY Student Association is pushing for a tuition increase because we've got a crisis, and we got to pitch in. So, what you need to do is you need to be creative, you need to be hopeful, you need to understand that throughout the history of this country, it has always been small social movements that have caused the greatest and the largest changes. You need to live without fear. You need to think on your feet. You need to be smart, and you need to be careful, but you need to be loud.
I'm not afraid.
Right. Right. But you should be afraid because yeah.
I am, but there's only so much they can do.
Right. But you need, and that's the whole thing is,
What more could they do?
your resistance has to be cagey. You don't, I was never one for civil disobedience whereby you line up with your hands like this to be taken off to jail.
No, yeah.
My idea was I always wear sneakers and I run, right? So it's, and I've been working with short memes, right? Because we're only allowed 7-second soundbite now in the media. So how do you take all of this, right? And basically we're talking about, this classical neoliberal global dominant exploitation by capital, right? And its impact on third world and first world workers and yada yada. How do we take this and how do we take this entire, run-on sentence of a problem? It used to be simple. Vietnam War, of course, war sucks, no war, peace now. It was very easy, but now everything is so much more complicated. It's all interconnected. How do we take this and make it and fit it within the 7-second soundbite the media might one day allow us? So I've been looking at memes. tax the rich. 3 syllables. It pretty much said everything you really need to say. You know, you scream it, and spray paint it on a wall, put it on a bumper sticker, put it on your chest, you know, tax the rich. And then my latest one is unionize everybody, right? You know, you're upset that union workers actually have benefits and actually have health care? Then join a fucking union. I mean, you know, and you don't have a union? Organize one, you know? So like, we need to like develop memes, you know? I'm a communication, right, professional, so I understand you can't plaster the entire back of your car with bumper stickers because there's too much clutter. So I'm good for 2 or 3 words on the back of my car, right? What's those 2 or 3 words going to be? Right now, I'm thinking nobody really understands the problem with natural gas fracking. So right now, I've got a natural gas fracking bumper sticker. But think about it. Think about always. I mean, oh yeah, and then, you know, when we talk about racism and I do workshops on racism, one of the things I really, you know, always need to focus on is, and the same holds true for misogyny, you know, for gender hatred, is that we, you know, most of us like to really think of ourselves as being anti-racist and so on, right? But we acquiesce to racism with our silence when we're sitting at a bar and somebody 2 stools down says something racist and you say nothing. As men, we acquiesce to violence against women and misogyny if somebody on the next stool is talking shit and we say nothing. It's a really rough responsibility. The same thing holds true with class war, is that, you know, all of your social interactions become educational opportunities. I'm not saying that we become so dogmatic, repeating political mantras to the point that we become insufferable to our friends, but you gotta work this stuff into the conversation because your friends will be repeating their mantras to you, and so you just have to, you know, it's multifaceted. But historically, we will win, right? You know, if you look at history, you know, this is a really tough position to be in. It's kind of depressing, right? But historically, we will win. It just might be a long time from now. But, yeah.
A question about Reagan. Prior to Bush, he was George W. He was the politician I hated most, and it was just shocking to me that there was such a great parade and hoopla, you know, with his death, and he was a great hero. I can understand why the 1% would love him, but I don't understand why it seemed like the majority of the country loved him.
Revisionist history. It's what we teach in high school, right? So we don't talk about the mining of the harbors in Nicaragua. We don't talk about, you know, we don't talk about the death in El Salvador. We don't talk about the genocide in Guatemala. And we certainly don't talk about the economic disparity that he fostered in this country. But we have this revisionist history that he taught us how to be proud individuals, how not to rely on the nanny state, you know. And it's the same thing with Columbus. Columbus was a much, you know, exponentially nastier, vile monster than Ronald Reagan. And we celebrate him even more. You know, there are more places in this country named after Columbus than there are named after any other historical figure except for George Washington. And there was no Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was a myth created by Washington Irving based loosely on the life of Christopher Colon. And Christopher Colon wasn't the great explorer. That was Pinzon. Christopher Colon was the person who got the corporate backing for the expedition. He came over here to find gold, ostensibly to finance the reconquest of Jerusalem from the Moors. Always goes back to the Middle East, right? You know, I mean, so if we celebrate Columbus and we have parades and holidays, then why wouldn't we celebrate Reagan? You know? Yeah.
Maybe it might help to basically call a couple of, for example, expressions that one of his songs basically has a line of, "Where can I get a job?" And once you start going in that direction and kind of try and figure out, most people don't even know what creates wealth anymore, which is basically if you grow it, make it, mine it, or steal it. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you steal it, it's kind of phony. It can only last as long as you can actually maybe steal it from it. But most people have no idea what creates wealth. And basically, in the creation of wealth, that's actually where you can get a job. So if you've got more of an economy based on a kleptocracy, you know, after a while, you're not going to have any jobs. And when people start to focus on where can I get a job, what's going to change things to actually allow wealth to be created and allow wealth to be, jobs to be made, maybe they might focus found out and less on the other stuff.
Right, but
There's a lot of other good Zappa songs.
right, but also the lack of jobs, until they all disappear and everything grinds to a halt, you know, disappearing jobs is good for the plutocracy. Because, you know, if suddenly there are no jobs, and I have one, then you're going to want my job, and you'll do it for half as much as I'm doing it for. I'm going to want somebody else's job, and that's all good for the bottom line until the system grinds to a halt. So we've, you know, in the 1970s, I forget exactly what the date was, but the government in, I believe it was either Norway or Sweden, collapsed because the unemployment rate hit 3%. And that was a social emergency and the government collapsed. In this country, if the unemployment rate falls below 6%, we consider that to be an emergency because it's going to cause inflation. What do you mean by inflation? It means workers are going to start making more money. That's a bad thing. So we've all been trained to hate inflation because what does it mean? It means we're going to make more money, right? Okay. Yeah.
One of the things we can do directly Tuesday is participate in the Fight Back USA, which is a nationwide teach-in. 120 colleges already signed up. City campus here is one of them. Cornell West, Francis Activism are leading an hour-and-a-half discussion on reclaiming America, followed up by an hour discussion of what you can do locally.
Right. Tuesday's the 5th?
Yes.
Yeah.
2 o'clock,
Right.
2 o'clock in the afternoon. You can all sign up at your respective colleges. It's a national teach-in and it's streamed live.
Also, on Monday the 4th, at 4 p.m., on Niagara Street, a little ways up from City Hall, the workers at, I think it's the Batia Clinic on the Lower West Side, Collider Health is shutting down that unionized facility. And the services it provides for the neighborhood are going to be severely diminished, and they're going to be replacing it with a non-unionized service, the likes of which is not quite clear. So the Communication Workers of America has put out a call for everybody to come and help them at 4 p.m. on Niagara Street and join them in that picket line. So, you know, join. I mean, it's really important right now, you know, to join with the unions. The unions are the only organizations that are large enough to take on the plutocracy at any level. And that is why, out of the blue, out of nowhere, you're seeing this war on what the UN declares is an unassailable human right, which is a right to collectively bargain. It's in the UN Charter of Human Rights, which the US was a co-signatory to, right? So this war on unions, you know, is basically taking away from us the strongest ally that we the people have. So 4 p.m. on Niagara Street, if you want to, you know, go out and practice your shouting. Yeah? I believe so. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
But people should support their unions wherever they are. It's very important to have that solidarity.
And organize them, right? And you can organize unions, you know, working with established union powers and working through the Public Employees Relation Board if you're a public employee, you know, having card drives. Or I see you have an IWW shirt, the Industrial Workers of the World, you know, one big union, you know. The IWW is organizing Starbucks, and they're not working with the AFL-CIO at all. They're just kind of a wildcat on the street, in your face, like there's 10 of us, we work here, we're declaring ourselves a union. You give us a raise or we're leaving, right? You know, so again, try to organize wherever you can. It can be really difficult because there's all kinds of hungry people that want your job. Any other questions? Okay.
Bernie Sanders a good thing to put on your bumper sticker?
He is, but the problem with putting Bernie Sanders on your bumper sticker is that it's good in that people who know who Bernie Sanders is and know what he represents will feel that we are not alone, and that will be helpful and useful. But you know, the other 99.9% of the people who drive by your car, you know, won't know what you're talking about. I mean, there's a function of protests, and I oftentimes would go to protests. We'd have, you know, some amazingly large number of people. We'd be out in the streets. We'd be screaming. We go home. We watch it on TV. We're told there's a ridiculously small number of people, and it's like a 7-second news story. You know, 10 minutes into a newscast filled with fluff and high school sports. And that people get demoralized, think it's a waste of time. But those demonstrations are extremely important for two reasons. You know, when you go to Washington and you march, you know, you're back home in rural Ohio, you know, or Indiana, you know, or you know, Binghamton, and you feel you're all alone in your crazy view, right? And then suddenly you stand there with 10,000 other people. That's empowering. And that charges you up to go home and do whatever it is that you're doing and know you're not alone. And do it for another few years. But there's also another reason. You go to that demonstration and you're there and you experience it, and you witness it, and then you go home and you watch the lies about what you just lived on the news. That's a crash course in media literacy. And that's really important too. Okay, thank you for having me.